How to sew the Starflower quilt, part of the Just Charming range by Amber Makes. Use charm squares and plain fabric to make this oh so pretty quilt. Cutting out. You need to sort out and cut out your charm squares for your quilt. You will need some for the centres and some for the star points. So arrange them all into piles so you know which charm squares you're going to use for which sections of the quilt. All of this is listed in the instructions. Making the block centres. Place one centre top and bottom border right sides together along the top edge of one of the centre squares and pin it into place. Make sure you match the top raw edges and the side edges. Turn it around and place another centre top and bottom border along the bottom edge. Again, pin it into place, matching the raw edges. Now stitch together to hold them in place. Once this is done, press the seams over to one side towards the borders, not towards the centre. Now take two centre side borders, place one right sides together across the top of the joined piece. Place the joined piece, the one with the centre and the top and bottom borders on top, because it's always best to stitch pieces together with the piece with the most seams on the top, so you can make sure that the seams stay laying to one side where you pressed them earlier. So pin it into place all the way along the top edge, making sure you match raw edges. Take the other centre side border and place that right sides facing along the other side. Again, pin together, matching the raw edges along the top and also along the side edges so that the border fits exactly. Now sew these two side borders into place. Once that's done, open them out and press the seam allowances towards the side borders. This completes one block centre. Repeat this with the remaining centre squares, centre top and bottom borders and centre side borders to make 16 block centres in total. You can see I've got them here in 3 different colourways of background fabric and 3 different types of prints. Making the HSTs. We'll start by making one HST. So take one of the background HST squares and draw a diagonal line from one corner to the opposite corner. I've used a heat erasable pen for this. Now place this right sides facing with one print HST square, making sure all the raw edges match up. Pin it together. Now place these pins about an inch away from the line because you're going to be sewing either side of this line. So if you make sure the pins are out of the way, then you can keep them in place while you're sewing, and this will keep it straighter. Now you need to sew 1/4 of an inch either side of the drawn line, just like this. Remove all the pins and then cut along the drawn line. You can use your sewing machine foot to make sure you stitch 1/4 of an inch outside it, or draw those lines on if you prefer. Now to turn this into a square, open up the 2 triangles and press the seam to one side. I like to press it towards the darker fabric because then it won't show up as much. So for this I'm pressing it towards the print HST square. And then open up the other pair of triangles and you've created 2 squares. Now these are slightly bigger than you need them to be, as it's much more accurate to make them a little bit bigger and then trim them to fit afterwards. So when you assemble your quilt, everything is perfect. So take one of those squares, place it on your cutting mat, and now we're going to trim it to 4.5 inches square. So if you place the diagonal line on your ruler along the seamed line, making sure that it's central, so that you've got the same amount coming out either side. Now trim it along one side, then turn it round, place the 4.5 inch mark on your ruler on the left hand side, as you can see, and then trim the other side. Now we just need to trim the other two sides, so turn it round just once, place the ruler back on top and trim off the right hand side, making sure that you've got the same amount so that the edges of the one side and the 4.5 inch mark are lining up. So trim off one side and then turn it round and trim off the other side, but making sure you match up the 4.5 inch mark on the left hand side. Now you've got a perfectly accurate 4.5 inch HST. Repeat that to trim the other one you've just made. Now you need to repeat this with all the background HST squares and the print ones to make 128 HSTs in total. You need to use 8 HSTs for each of the Starflower blocks. So choose how you want to arrange these, remembering that all of 8 of those will go round one of the block centres. Once you've arranged them, sort them into 16 groups. I've clipped mine together so that I can remember which is which, but you could use pins. Clip them into your 16 groups and then they're ready for when you make your stars. Making the Starflower blocks. Take one group of HSTs, 4 corner squares, 1 block centre, and place them right side up in the arrangement shown to form a star. You can rearrange the points of the star at this point to make sure that the prints aren't all touching, or if you want to have them same, but just rearrange it until you're happy with what the star looks like. Once this is done and you are happy with the arrangement, take the 2 HSTs in the top row and pin them together so that the raw edges are matching. Then the 2 HSTs in the bottom row and pin those together. Those diagonal seams need to match up, but because you've trimmed your HSTs, that should happen quite easily. So pin those together, that's the bottom row. Now to form the right side row, take 1 block corner square and pin that to the top of that HST. Then pin the first HST to the second HST. And then pin the corner square to the bottom, so that you've created a row of 4 to make one side piece. Now repeat this to pin the other side row together, starting with the corner square. If you keep everything laid out flat and right sides up while you're doing this, then you can be sure that you're pinning together in the correct order. I find it easier to pin all the rows and then sew them, and then I don't get mixed up. Now you can sew all of these pinned seams together. So I've relaid them back out in the order they were now that they're sewn together. So take that top row, place it right sides together across the top of the block centre. That's why it helps to, after you've seamed things, to lay it all back up again, and then you know that you're sewing the right row to the right place. Make sure you match the top raw edges and the side raw edges, but there are no seams to match here. Sew that together. Take the bottom row and place that right sides together with the bottom of the block centre. Pin it together, matching the side and the bottom raw edge, and making sure those raw edges match all the way along the top, so pop a pin in the centre, but there are no seams to match up here. Once you've sewn those together, you've got the top row attached to the block centre and the bottom row. Now you can attach the two side rows. So place the right side row, right sides facing along the right side. Turn it around for pinning. Now you need to match the seam at the bottom of the corner square with the seam at the bottom of that HST, just so that you get neat edges. So pin the seams together, and then at the bottom make sure you match up these two seams. So pin those together. Then pin the bottom edges, making sure that the raw edges match up. And then pin together in the centre. Now you can sew that into place. Take the left side row and place that right sides facing along the left edge of the block centre. Again, first pin into place, making sure you're matching the seams. And then pin across at the top. It's always best to pin it to match the seams before you place any other pins in, because those are the most crucial points. Once the seams are pinned together that need to match, you can then ease the fabric so that it fits in all the other places. And then pull it gently so that it fits. And then pin it together. Now you can sew these side seams into place. Once that's done, you have completed one Starflower block. I've pressed all the seams open for joining the top and the bottom and the side rows, just to make it a bit neater. And it will lie flatter. Now, you need to repeat this process with the remaining HSTs, corner squares and block centres to make 16 Starflower blocks in total. As you can see, I've got them in the 3 different colourways of plain fabric and prints. And I've alternated my charm squares so that the star points are different. But you can do yours in whichever way you want. You can have all the same star points or different. Attaching the sashing. Lay out the 16 Starflower blocks in rows with 4 Starflower blocks in each row in your chosen arrangement. I've done this on my kitchen floor just because it's the biggest space. Now, you need to lay the sashing strips between each block with the sashing squares at each corner, just like this. Rearrange them until you're happy with the placement, then take a photo to remind you which block and which sashing square goes where. Now to join the rows together, take the first block in the top left-hand corner in row 1 and sew one of the sashing strips to the right-hand side. I've turned this over because I prefer to sew pieces together with the most seams on the top to make sure that the seam allowances stay pressed open or to one side, whichever you've done. Pin them together at either end, matching raw edges, and then pin in the centre. There's no seams to match when you're sewing on the sashing strips, so it's quite simple. I usually put pins in at the seam points or regularly across. Now when that's done and you've pinned it into place, you can take the next Starflower block in the top row and join that to the other side of the sashing strip. It's up to you whether you pin and sew or whether you pin all of the sashing strips in each row together and then sew them together. It doesn't really matter. Again, make sure the Starflower block is on top so that you can ensure those seams stay pressed open. Pin together at either end and then making sure the raw edges match. Give it a little pull to make sure it's evenly spaced and then pin it into place. Now sew those together. So you now need to pin the next sashing strip into place, and then the other Starflower block will go on the other side of it. And then one more sashing strip. Pin them into place in exactly the same way that we did with the first two blocks, and then pin the final Starflower block in row 1. Once that's done, you have finished row 1. I've pressed all the seams open for these to make sure that everything lies nice and flat later on when you're quilting it. So take the time to press the seams after you've sewn all the blocks together. Then repeat this to create each of the 4 rows, making sure you sew them together in the same order that you laid them out flat. So I've got 4 rows in total now. Now before we join the rows together, we need to create a horizontal sashing row. These are made up from sashing strips and sashing squares. You placed these out flat earlier, so remember which order you place them in, just so that you get the colours right. So take one sashing strip and pin the first sashing square beneath it. This will be the horizontal row that goes beneath the first row of blocks that you've just joined together. Take another sashing strip and pin that right sides facing to the other side of the square. Then take another square and pin that to the other end of the sashing strip. Again, another sashing strip to the other side of the square, so we're just creating one long row that alternates sashing strips with sashing squares. And then put the final square on the end of this strip. And finally, put the last sashing strip on the other end of the square. Now sew these all together to create the whole horizontal sashing row. You need to repeat this process with the remainder of the rows that you laid out before, so that you create all the horizontal rows. So you'll have 3 horizontal rows in total. Press the seams open, because this will help it to lie flat when you're matching it to the blocks. Now I've finished all the others, so I've got my 3 horizontal rows ready to join all the sashing blocks together. So take row 1 of your Starflower blocks and pin the first horizontal sashing row to the bottom edge, right sides facing. So I like to make sure it's all in place first. Place it all right sides facing, just so that nothing's twisted before you pinning it all into place. Lay it all out flat. Again, the row is along the bottom edge of the first row of Starflower blocks. Now you can pin it all into place. Now the most important thing is that those sashing squares match up with the bottom of the vertical sashing strips that you've got between the Starflower blocks. So matching up the seams of the sashing square with the bottom edge of the vertical sashing strip, pin those into place. These really need to match up so that you get a nice neat finish. Once you've pinned that square, then pin the end of the sashing strip to the end of the Starflower block. Then just move it all slightly, making sure the raw edges match up and it fits evenly across. They are the right size, it's just sometimes with the seaming it can pull the fabric in, so you might need to pull the Starflower block a little bit. Now again, pin the other sashing square so that the seams match up with the bottom edges of the vertical sashing strip that joins the two Starflower blocks together. And then pin together between. And then for the final sashing square, again, match up the seams with the bottom edges of the vertical sashing rows and pin together. And then pin the sashing strip into place. It's worth taking the time here to put in lots of pins to make sure everything's even. Then when you come to machining, you can just whiz it through the machine without having to worry about having to rearrange anything. And in that way, you get a neater finish. Match up the side edges. Give it a little pull so everything is lying nice and flat. And pin it into place. Now sew the horizontal sashing row into place, removing the pins as you go. Once that's done, press the seam open and flat, because this will help your finished quilt top to lie flat when you quilt it later. Now take row 2 of the Starflower blocks and sew that to the bottom of your horizontal row, just like you laid out earlier on the floor. Then take your next horizontal row, pin that to the bottom until you've completed the whole quilt top. Adding the outer border. Each of the 4 outer border strips is made of 2 strips which are joined together with a straight seam, then cut to the correct length. These measurements are all listed in the instructions. Press the seams open on the joins. Now fold it in half and mark the centre point. This will help you to sew it correctly to the join blocks. Now take the top of your joined Starflower blocks with all the sashing strips and fold that in half along the top edge and mark the centre point with a pin. And then open it out. Place the top outer border right sides facing on top. First match those centre pins and pin together. And then you can pin it together at the left hand edge. Make sure your strip isn't twisted. You can see where I've rearranged mine. I've seen now it's twisted, so I've turned it over and pin it together again, making sure the side raw edges and the top raw edges match up. Now you're just working on one centre, one half of it at a time, so pin that into place. Pin the other end of the outer border strip to the right hand corner of the top edge of the join blocks and pin it together. Now pin it together all the way along the top edge, making sure all the raw edges are matching. Take the other outer border strip, the one that you're going to use for the bottom, and then move the join block so that you've got the bottom edge and pin it into place, again matching the centres each time. Now to make the side borders, take one of the outer border strips that you've cut earlier and take one of the squares, these are the outer border corners, and pin one to the top of that side border strip, and then making sure it stays right sides up, so untwist it as you go along. Take another outer border corner and pin that to the bottom of the outer border strip. Make sure the raw edges are matching. Pin it together all the way along and sew. You make the other side outer border strip in exactly the same way. Take one of your outer border corners and sew that to the top, and take the other outer border corner and sew that to the bottom. This creates your two side outer borders. Now pin these in place. Pin the right one to the right side of the join blocks. Again, it's worth folding the outer border strip in half first and marking with a pin, and folding all the joined blocks together in half and marking with a pin. Then match these pins and pin the whole thing together. If you work in halves like this, it's easier to get it to fit. If you find that difficult to get it all to fit, then you can always measure and mark it into quarters instead. So that's one outer border corner. Make sure you've pinned it all into place. Then take the other side outer border. Move your join blocks so that you've got the left hand edge. And then pin the side outer border to the left hand edge, again making sure you match up the seams at the bottom of the outer border corners with the seams on the side. Then sew the outer borders into place. You can see I've laid it all out flat here, so you can see all the outer borders are now attached. Once you've quilted your quilt top, you can add the binding. Take the binding strip, so take one plain fabric eye binding strip and cut off the selvages. Next, cut the strip into quarters, so if you leave it folded in half, just trim off the end. That cuts it into half. Then fold that strip again into half. And along that halfway mark, you've now cut your binding strip into 4 binding rectangles. Repeat this with the remaining plain fabric A, plain fabric B, plain fabric C and background fabric binding strips. You will have 40 binding rectangles in total, which is enough to bind the whole quilt. Now we're going to join them together alternately, so you don't have the same colours together, to make a scrappy binding strip. So take one binding rectangle and place another binding rectangle right sides facing on top so that they're at right angles like this. Mark the bottom right hand corner where the bottom strip matches the top and draw a diagonal line from the top left to the bottom right hand corner. Pin it together. Joining diagonally like this reduces bulk in the seams when you're binding the whole quilt later, and also makes a more attractive finish. Sew together along the drawn line. When this is done, remove the pins and trim the seam allowance to 1/4 inch. Now open out the 2 pieces and press that seam open. Again, this will reduce bulk and also allow your binding to lie flatter when you sew it into place. So repeat this process to join all 40 binding rectangles together, alternating the colours as you go. You now have one long binding strip. So take your finished quilted top and mark the centre of one of the sides. I've done the right hand side here. Take one end of your long binding strip and place it right sides facing on top. Measure 4 inches up or down from the top of the binding strip and pin this into place so the binding strip is 4 inches above the centre of the right hand side. Pin this into place. You'll need this extra when you're joining the binding strips later. Now measure 4 inches down from that centre pin. This is where you're going to start sewing. It just means you've now got 8 inches when you join them together later, because you need this allowance so that you get a nice join, which I'll show you how to do when we get to that point. Now pin the binding strip into place all the way down that right hand side edge, making sure the raw edges are matching and those seam allowances which join the binding rectangles together stay open. So starting from that pin you marked 8 inches from the top of the binding strip, sew it together all the way down the side, stopping stitching 1/2 inch from the bottom of the quilt and then stitching diagonally to the corner. You can see the line I've drawn here. Now turn the quilt around. So we're working along the bottom edge of it now. We're going to create a mitered corner, which is a nice neat corner. So fold the binding strip upwards so the raw edge of the binding strip lies in a straight line along the bottom edge of the quilt. Pin that into place. If you give it a press, it's just neat. You'll get a neater finish when you do your binding mitered corners later. Now fold the top of the binding strip down so that you've got a fold that lies exactly along the raw edge of the binding strip. Again, press this in place and you'll get a neater, flatter finish. Then pin that into place. You can remove that bottom pin and put it back on top. In the same way as you did before, pin the strip all the way down the side and start stitching from the top all the way down to the bottom, and again stopping 1/2 inch before the edge. And then you've got neat corners all the way along. Once you've mitered all the 4 corners, you can join the binding strip together. I like to join this diagonally. It gives a neater finish too. So the way to do this is you stop stitching 8 inches above the top of where you started stitching, as you can see from here. Now lay the end of the binding strip on top of the starting end, and from where the end starts, you can see where the pin is underneath. You need to cut the top of it to the same width as the binding strip. This is the overlap. See, the binding strip is 2 1/4 inches wide, so measure 2 1/4 inches down from that point. Draw a straight line and cut along, and then you will have a 2 1/4 inch overlap, which is exactly the same width as the binding strip. Now to join these together diagonally, place the 2 ends of the binding strips together at right angles. Because you've left an 8-inch gap, there's enough fabric to do this with. So pin them together. You bend the quilt slightly to do this, but you've got enough space. Now lay those 2 ends down flat. . and draw a line from the bottom corner, where the bottom binding strip meets the top, up to the top corner. This is going to be your sewing line. So sew along this line to join them. When that's done, you can remove those pins and trim the seam allowance. This is exactly the same way that you joined the binding rectangles together at the beginning. Now press that seam open and flat. You've now joined the two ends of the binding strip together. They will fit exactly along the edge of your quilt, and you'll have a diagonal join, which makes it much neater and will lie flatter as well. Now you can pin the binding strip, that 8 inches that you've got gap, that you've got unstitched. Pin it so that the raw edges match. All the way along. And you can see it fits perfectly. Now sew it together, overlapping the seams at either end, so that you've joined your whole binding strip all the way along. Now you can see that it's all joined into place very neatly. So now we need to turn the binding over to the other side and finish it off. So fold the binding outwards and press all the way round so that the binding is lying nice and flat and that seam is right on the edge. And you can see that you've got a neat mitered corner. So press those corners as well. Make sure the binding is laying with the seam right on the edge. Now turn it over to the wrong side of the quilt. Fold the edge over, the raw edge, over to the wrong side of the quilt and press it all the way round. That will give you a nice crisp edge. You can see that we're going to create a 1/2 inch binding here, which gives a nice deep edge to your quilt. So fold the raw edge over so it matches with the edge of the quilt and pin it into place. So you fold it, turn it under, and you're just going to cover the machine stitching where you sewed the binding on in the first place. Now, before you do the mitered corner, it's easier if you fold and pin the other binding into place first. Fold it up into an angle like this, and then fold it back down, and then you get a nice mitered corner on the wrong side of the quilt as well. And pin it into place, and then continue doing this all the way around the edge of the quilt. Pinning and folding, and you can press it at this stage if you want as well. You can see the mitered corner on the right side and the mitered corner on the wrong side. You now need to stitch this into place by machine or by hand. I prefer to slip stitch it by hand, as I think you get a neater finish. And you can see that you've got nice neat mitered corners. And because we've used the same fabrics that were used in the front of the quilt to create this scrappy binding, it matches beautifully and adds a nice finish to the edge of your quilt. Your quilt's now finished and ready to hang.